Welcome to Grounded, the show that dives into the news that might have you feeling a little bit untethered. Along with our guests, we're here to discuss and hopefully help us all stay grounded in light of the news that's happening. I'm Maritsa Georgiou, a long-time political journalist, alongside my co-host, former U.S. Senator John Tester of Montana.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Maritza, and good to have our listeners on. When I got in the United States Senate and somebody got to me and said it's going to be like drinking from a fire hose, I feel like I've been drinking from a fire hose for the last month, the amount of stuff that's coming out of Washington, D.C. And as we've said before, you know, a lot of the stuff that Trump is trying to do, I get it. Making government more efficient is really, I think, it's one thing that people need to do that are in elected office. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing coming out of Washington, D.C. is not a lot of checks and balances and everything being done with a meat axe instead of a scalpel. And I think that if you're going to make sure that we have a government that works for the people moving forward, you've got to think about what you're doing and you just can't slice and dice and worry about it later because it has real effects on people. But we'll talk about that today. And one of the people we're going to have on is a former colleague of mine, or maybe I should say I was a former colleague of hers, Jeanne Shaheen, the great senator out of New Hampshire, and she'll be joining us in a bit. She recently been to the G7, the Munich Security Conference, and then also spent some time in Ukraine last week too.
Yeah, we have a
What?
lot to talk to her about, especially after that conference in Ukraine or in Munich, excuse me, and some of the headlines we're seeing coming out of Ukraine. So let's go over a few headlines before we get to her, because this is kind of a bonus episode. We've been recording these on Monday, but we are going to just add another episode to the week because there's so much to talk about, and because Senator Shaheen was so gracious to give her some of her time today. But we certainly have a lot of headlines to talk about since we recorded on Monday. And Thursday afternoon, the Senate voted to confirm Kash Patel as FBI director, with two Republicans actually breaking with the Democrats on this. Supporters praise the pick, saying he will bring transparency, and critics worry about what they labeled as an enemy list that Patel wrote about in his book, and that they have concerns about him weaponizing the FBI. Now, he has denounced that and said he won't seek retribution. Thoughts?
Well, I mean, my thoughts are is that time will tell on all this stuff. I think that there are a lot of senators with many of the picks in the cabinet and other agencies that were not tickled pink with the picks, and you could tell by the questions that they asked. Yeah, I think Patel falls in that category. As we say with, excuse me, as we say with all the nominees that are confirmed, we want them to be successful, but certainly don't want the FBI to be weaponized. It's very, very important for our national security to make sure we have an FBI that works and works as is intended to do. And we'll just see. Patel certainly has a lot of baggage, and we'll see how that works out moving forward.
Okay, another big talker this week. On Wednesday, the White House shared an image on its official Instagram and X accounts. And it was an AI, it seemed to be AI generated image of a fake Time magazine cover with President Trump wearing a gold crown and the words "Long live the king" at the bottom. That caption references congestion pricing being dead in New York after the White House ordered a stop to that city's congestion pricing, which basically charges more in tolls to use congested roads, excuse me, which was designed to cut down on pollution and heavy traffic.
So there's two parts to this equation. Number one is the part that Angus King talks about, the democracy, the exception, and dictatorships, and the rule throughout the history of this world. And I think we need to be cognizant of that moving forward. We have a democracy, we have freedoms, we have liberties, and we need to make sure that those are protected and ensured moving forward. The other thing that's, I think, equally as disturbing for me is that I've always believed that the government closest to the people is the best government. And I think anytime you've got Washington, D.C., or in our case, the state government, coming down to local jurisdictions, counties, or municipalities and saying, you know what, you don't know better than we do. Even though you live there every day and you do what you need to do every day to survive, we know more than you, and we're going to stop you from doing things. The only time that should come into to play is if it's an unconstitutional law. Otherwise, I think you give those local jurisdictions as much latitude as possible. And what we're seeing is the federal government literally coming in and saying, I don't care what you want. We know better than you. We're smarter than you are. And we're going to put our rule on top of you. Now they've got the right to do that, but I still don't think that's the best. That's the best form.
Yeah, we will see kind of what happens there. We've seen a lot of criticism from Democrats, not a lot of criticism from Republicans about that image. The New York Times out with some breaking news on Thursday morning after obtaining a document that they say shows the Trump administration has plans to nearly eliminate the office in charge of recovery from large disasters, like things like hurricanes and wildfires. It says the White House plans to cut the staff of that department by 84%, which could slow the distribution of recovery money to communities hit hard. And I don't have to tell you, many communities in hurricane zones and tornado alley are predominantly in red states.
If the number of these disasters were going down and not becoming as huge and as devastating as they are today, I could see a reason to cut back on this. But blame it on whatever you want. I happen to blame it on our climate changing. But we're seeing disasters, hurricanes, floods, even Montana wildfires. Look at the flood that happened on Yellowstone Park a few years ago that pretty much devastated that economy for a pretty good length of time. And FEMA was there almost immediately to deal with those businesses and those families that have been upended by those disasters. And that happens whether you're in a hurricane region or wildfire or floods or whatever it may be. And it's one of those things where if it's why I think we ought to try to lead the world in climate change. I think it'll help our economy, but it'll also help reduce some of those natural disasters that are taking place far more often now than I ever remember as a kid. And so we've got to be really careful where people who are hung out because of these disasters may not get the support they need to recover. That'll have real negative impacts on our economy.
We've already seen communities speak out saying they're still waiting for FEMA money, that it's already a slow process. So, yeah, that is something that we will be watching. The other big talker this week, President Trump's comments on Ukraine, and it's President Volodymyr Zelensky. And that seems like an excellent time to bring in our special guest, Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, who just actually returned from Ukraine. Senator, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, you were just at the Munich Security Conference, appearing actually on stage with Ukrainian President Zelensky, and then you went to Ukraine. Thank you so much for being with us.
So nice to be with you and with my good friend, John Tester. It's always fun to be on with John. Uh, yes, we had a very serious trip to Munich. There was a great deal of concern about the United States position on Ukraine. I had a chance to talk about the importance of supporting, continuing to support President Zelensky and the war in Ukraine because of what it means for us here at home. We know that our allies and partners are watching what we do in Ukraine. We know that our adversaries, that Xi in China, that Iran, North Korea are all watching closely. They all have a stake in supporting Russia in Ukraine. And it would undermine our own national security to pull out of Ukraine at this time.
So I want to talk to you a little bit more about that, Jane. So we always talk about our four major opponents in the world are Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. This is a conflict in part of Europe. There's other conflicts going around the world. There's certainly what's going on in Israel has been a high priority for Congress too. We know what China said they want to do in relationship to the Pacific Rim, particularly with Taiwan. Can you give me any insight on why this is a bigger thing than just Ukraine? If we're to pull out of Ukraine and let Putin have his way, attacking a democracy in Europe, why doesn't it just stay at that? Why is there more to it than just that?
Well, sadly, I think there would be. It is a message to our allies and partners. One of the things that has underpinned America's security since the end of World War II has been our ability um, to operate with our allies and partners around the world. It's one of our strengths. It is one of the things that has separated us from our adversaries. We know that Vladimir Putin, when he went into Ukraine, went in alone. Now, unfortunately, he's getting support from our other adversaries, from North Korea, from Iran, from China. We know that they are watching very closely what the United States does in Ukraine. We know that, at least what we have heard, and I think they're right, from Eastern European countries, from Poland, from the Baltic nations, in the north of Europe, from Romania, from Moldova, is that if Putin is successful in Ukraine, then he's coming for those other countries. They are very worried, and they have the experience of living in the Soviet Empire and knowing what that was like. So they're what we don't want is to abandon Ukraine at this time, to leave Vladimir Putin with free rein in Europe, and to have him attack one of our NATO allies, and under Article 5, to be called back in with boots on the ground to defend our NATO allies in Europe. I'm not interested. I know you're not interested because you and I have talked about this, John, about seeing um, our grand your our grandchildren fighting in Europe because we didn't take a strong stand now against Vladimir Putin and what he's doing.
Well, Gene, so the president, who has things a little bit mixed up here from the way history has it, talked about Ukraine, and Ukraine's the one who started the invasion, and that the problem is Zelensky, and I'm not going to go through all the things that he said that have been just totally inaccurate. But he has made his position, which is the position of the United States, him being the commander in chief, of basically turn over land to Ukraine, to Russia, that they've gotten from Ukraine, to not let Ukraine into NATO any stretch of imagination, to removal of troops, if that's true. The question is what can be done if this is what he's telling Ukraine, what he's telling Russia, what he's telling the world? What can be done to stop what's going on here? I agree with you. I've heard some of the Republicans in the Senate express some problems with what the president said. But what really can be done to stop it, to turn it around so it's like it was when we were supporting Ukraine's bid for democracy to be more like the West?
Well, as you point out, um, you don't start a negotiation by taking all your leverage off the table. And that's what Donald Trump is doing when he says Ukraine is never going to be a member of NATO, when he says they need to cede territory to Russia. He hasn't even talked about security guarantees. Any settlement, any peace negotiation needs to guarantee that Putin is not going to come back in and attack Ukraine in another 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We saw he's done that already. He did that when he took Crimea. Then he came back in 2022 to try and take more of Ukraine. So I think it's important to think about how we provide as much leverage as possible for Ukraine. We need Europe to step in and help with that. One of the things that I think is important is for Europe to step up to the plate. What President Trump is trying to do right now is to cut Europe out, but Europe has a lot at stake here. So they need to reinsert themselves into these discussions with Ukraine to talk about what can be done to provide security guarantees and what can be done to support Ukraine to be in the best position possible. You know, you and I remember that Donald Trump negotiated with the Taliban in Afghanistan to try and end that war. And what he did was basically give away the store. He negotiated without the Afghan government at the table, negotiated without any real effort to ensure that we had leverage for the future. And so what's happened? The Taliban came right back in. They overthrew the government. Well, what what Donald Trump is doing right now is talking from Russia's playbook. He's talking about elections. That's exactly what Vladimir Putin wants. He wants to be able to install a Russian puppet in Kyiv so that they're going to do what Russia wants. And what we need to see is we need to see the bipartisan support in Congress that exists for Ukraine speak up. When we were in Munich, we had a good group of bipartisan senators, Republicans and Democrats, and we all reassured Zelensky that um, Ukraine was going to be at the negotiating table in any effort to end the war. We reassured him of our commitment to continue to support Ukraine and their efforts to hold Russia at bay, that we support Ukrainian people who have shown such courage and resilience. And our Republican colleagues now need to step up. They need to talk about why it's in our interest to support Ukraine. And they need to let Donald Trump know that he's wrong, that he doesn't understand the situation here, and what he's doing is undermining our own national security.
I couldn't agree with you more, because if they don't speak up now and are very, very um, pointed with what they have to say about how wrong this is, it's going to have long-term consequences for this nation, and none of it is going to be good for the United States of America.
Senator Shaheen, I mean, it's really easy to think about Ukraine as some far off place that many of us have not been to. But you were there, you're on the ground. What are the people who have lives just like us here in the United States, what are they saying to you?
Well, they're very worried about what the United States is going to do. There were three of us who went on from Munich to Ukraine. Senator Bennett from Colorado, Senator Tillis, Republican from North Carolina, and I. The first place we visited after meeting with the ambassador was a transfer station for electricity, which showed the Ukrainians had come up with a design to protect their electric grid, because one of the places that the Russians have really attacked has been the electric grid, because they're trying to freeze out the people in the wintertime. And they came up with this really innovative design to protect the what I would call a transfer station, meant for them to keep the lights on for people, to keep people going to work, to keep their economy resilient. We then went from there to Bucha, which is, you may remember, the suburb of Kyiv, where the Russians had a 33-day siege. And it was just horrific to hear the atrocities that occurred there. They killed over 500 civilians. And we met with the mayor, we met with the priest who had many of his parishioners killed. And one of the things, we also met with the investigators who were investigating each of the murders individually. And they showed us the picture of the Russian commander who had given the order to kill indiscriminately any civilians they saw. So not only did they kill the civilians, they showed us the pictures of the mass graves, the people who were shot down in the streets, raped women, assaulted and terrorized the population. And they did it. And they said this was a very deliberate order. They did it to scare the people so that they would give in. And it was so impressive to hear the people of Bucha talking about where they are now, and they're rebuilding their community and they're not giving in. But the Russians were on the doorstep of Kyiv and they were stopped by the Ukrainians. We visited a children's hospital, the Amati Children's Hospital. You may remember that it was bombed last summer, and saw the video of the hundreds of volunteers who responded immediately to try and get the children out. We met with several teenage girls who were, it was heartbreaking. One young woman whose mother was killed in the attack, she had had 16 operations on her legs to see if she could walk again. They were hopeful that she's going to be able to walk, and her dad was there with her. We met another young woman who had lost a leg. She'd spent 8 months in the hospital. She was there being visited by her friend who had lost an arm. Um, and they were all, again, just not giving in. They are continuing to operate the hospital. They're doing everything they can to support the families, the people who have been injured. And for us to walk away from people who have shown that courage and that resilience would just be criminal.
Senator Shaheen, I just want to follow up a little bit on that because, after some of these comments from President Trump um, saying that Ukraine was the aggressor and that, calling Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator, we did see some pushback from some GOP senators saying, Russia was clearly the aggressor, but not a full condemnation. And I just remember, I interviewed Senator Steve Daines after he went to Ukraine and describing some of the things that you're describing now. And he called Vladimir Putin a terrorist at the time. Senator Lindsey Graham introduced a resolution last year to designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. So I'm wondering, what is it going to take? Who should hold these GOP senators responsible and accountable to send a clear message to Ukraine and to Russia, no matter what the president is saying, that they stand by those commitments?
Well, I hope they're hearing from some of their constituents who are concerned about what they're saying. Some of those um, people in our own military and our own defense industrial base who have benefited from the National Security Supplemental Bill, 70% of that went to our own defense industrial base in the U.S., that they're hearing from members of the military who are talking about what we're learning from the Ukrainians because of what's happening in this war. Um, and hopefully they're going to continue to speak out as they hear more and more of the president's inaccuracies of his, um, I don't, again, I don't know what the strategy is. I said this when we were in Munich after Vice President Vance gave his speech that basically was designed to antagonize all of our European allies, that I don't understand a strategy that says we're going to try and build up America's national security by undermining our allies, by complimenting our adversaries, and by antagonizing the rest of the world because we pulled foreign assistance that we provided. We met with some people in Poland who were providing services for refugees, Ukrainian refugees who had gotten support from um, USAID for the programs that they were doing. We met with one woman who was providing um, help for children, taking care of kids who had fled the war. And she talked about how awful she felt when she was told she had to take down the American flags that were in the classrooms that were showing the kids who was providing the assistance that they were getting. We talked to one man who was providing mental health services for refugees who said, I can't, he said, I can't give you a report like I would normally because this is not a normal time. He said, we look up to the United States in Poland, and you've broken our trust. And he talked about some of the people that they had served. A young girl who he said, we don't know where she is now. She was cutting herself, doing harm to herself because of the impact of the war. He said, I don't know if she's still alive or not. A mother who he said can no longer come in and get services because there's no money now to provide the help that she needs. I mean, it's heartbreaking. He said, Poland has been one of the most pro-American countries in the world. And how could you do this? It's just heartbreaking.
Indeed, it is. And And who would have ever thought we'd have come to the point in this country where uh, a country wanted to be democratic. They wanted to make sure people had freedom and liberty, and we're doing everything we can to push them into the arms of China and Russia, dictatorships where privacy doesn't exist, where everything you do is being monitored by the government. Is just about as anti-American as anything that's ever happened in my lifetime. In fact, it is the most
Yes,
anti-American thing that's ever happened in my lifetime.
I agree. I mean, who would have thought we would be saying to our friends, take down those American flags because we don't want anybody to know that we have
So
helped you.
that's
I
right.
mean, how is that in America's interest? How does that make us more secure or safer or more prosperous? It doesn't do any of those things. Um, Donald
And
is not doing what he promised the people of this country he was going to do when he ran for reelection.
one other thing, and you may or may not know about this, is there any? Have you heard anything about China backfilling the stuff where USAID has been pulled out? Has China come in and backfilled any of that stuff so they can get the credit for being the good guys and make us look like the bad guys?
We have gotten some stories about that, um, and to date they've been in Africa and Asia. But yes, we're beginning to hear those stories already.
Well, it makes sense. That's what you do if you're cheating. If there's playing into your hands, you play the hand. So
Right.
yeah,
And one of the things that has been shut down has been all of um, the programs that are designed to compete with China to provide assistance to people um, who are being offered the Belt and Road Initiative from China.
yep,
Okay, Senator Jeanne Shaheen of the great state of New Hampshire. I'm being told that our time is up, but we thank you so much for joining us.
I just want to say before you get to close it out, Gene, man, I really appreciate senators like you that are willing to speak up and talk about right and talk about what we need to do to keep this country the greatest country in the world. And I just really respect your leadership and think about you guys a lot. It can't be a lot of fun back there as you watch the United States turn into something that we're not.
Well, you're absolutely right. We miss you. We wish you were still there. And we will hopefully, the American public will make their voices heard and let this president know that this is not the direction America should be going in. That we need to stand by our values. We need to stand by the leadership that the United States has played in the world since the end of World War II. And I thank you both for this opportunity and look forward to coming back to join you again soon.
Thanks, Gene.
Thanks. We look forward to it. We have a lot to unpack from what Senator Shaheen just told us. But I do wonder, what is it like for you to talk to her from your office in Big Sandy, Montana, instead of being there, instead of being in Washington, D.C., um, talking about this with your colleagues?
Well, in all honesty, I mean, the air is better in Big Sandy, Montana than it is in Washington, D.C. But the truth is that Jeanne Shaheen has a really, really important job. And if you listen to what she had to say with the experience that she had in G7 and what she saw happen there with the new leadership of the United States of America and how that leadership is trying to push away our allies and fall into the arms of dictatorships, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I know it doesn't make any sense to Gene either. And the frustration level back there has to be incredibly high. And and I just I it makes me worry uh, because Jean's a special person, and I worked with her a lot when I was in the United States Senate. She's a good person. She's not wild-eyed to the left or wild-eyed to the right. She's a down the middle kind of person who really, really shows a lot of common sense in her thoughts and her ideas and her policies. But I just, people got to stand up back there, and she was right when she said people that these folks got to hear from their constituents, And I know, because I get emails and phone calls every day saying it doesn't do any good. They just respond with a canned letter. But you got to keep it up, man. They're reading them, or you wouldn't get that response. So make sure that if you're letting folks know if they're doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing. It's important on both fronts. So it's there. I will say this: as far as this country moving forward, we're putting tariffs on our best friend in the world, in Canada, on our two largest trading partners, on other allies that we have around the world. Just we're treating them like they were our enemies. And I can tell you, our strength comes from our partnerships with other countries around the world. And you lose those partnerships, you lose your strength, and it opens a door for people who have do not share our values as Americans, as folks who believe in democracy, to come in and replace us in the world. I think of the reserve currency a lot because the economy of the world runs through the United States of America because of that reserve currency. And we have that because of predictability and consistency in our government. There's nothing that says we have to be the country that has reserve currency. In fact, it's moved around a lot over the nation, the world's history. And when we start becoming unpredictable, when we stop losing the consistency that we've had since World War II, it is reasonable to think that the world will turn to some other country to run their economies through. And that would be very, very, very bad for us. And certainly not how you would make America great again. And so, we've got to work cut out for us, but I still believe in this country. And I believe this country has the ability to bounce back from difficult situations that they have in the past. But it takes people not sitting on their hands, but speaking up and talking to their elected officials.
There's a new poll that I think is fascinating to me if we're looking at the numbers, because this poll, this Quinnipiac University poll, finds that Democrats hit an all-time low as far like when it comes to congressional job approval. Republicans hit a record high. And in the same poll, when asked about Vladimir Putin, 81% think the United States should not trust Russian President Vladimir Putin. So what does that tell you?
It tells me that things haven't changed since the Cuban Missile Crisis. They haven't changed since the end of World War II. And you got to be careful of who you making friends with, because quite honestly, that old bear can turn around and eat you. And so, in the end, the real winner on all this stuff that happened this last week is China. They're the ones that are really they're really raking it in because they want to be the leader in the world economically and militarily. They want the economy to run through them. And we have shown uncertainty and inconsistency, and they're the great beneficiaries of this. And we've got to be careful. Nothing happens by accident. And so I agree with you. Folks need to stand up and just do what's right. If it costs them their office because they get primaried, so be it. At least you've done what's right.
Okay, before any final thoughts before we open it up to listeners?
No, I don't have anything else. It's just an interesting time. We live in interesting times, Maritsa.
We sure do. And before we go, again, we want to ask you, our listeners, what you're thinking about, what you're hearing that you want clarity on, what's on your mind, what do you want us to dive into. You can email us at groundedpcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram and Blue Sky. It's all about trying to stay grounded in this time. Again, we want to thank Senator Jeanne Shaheen for joining us. And of course, our friends at Pearl Jam for letting us use their music. And thank you for spending part of your day with us.